it is crucial that the wealthiest nations, which have done the most to put high levels of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, carry the greatest financial responsibility going forward. And that financial responsibility means they need to be defossilizing their economies faster than the rest of the world. We must get there well before 2050 with the developed world, and at the same time do their best to help developing countries make this transition.
Hello, everybody. The title of this topic is The Path Beyond Fossil Fuels, Seeking a Just and Orderly Transition. And it's mostly based on a report by the Climate Crisis Advisory Group that was just released exactly 1 week ago. This presentation, this press conference is put on by the climateemergencyforum.org, and we would like to thank Sustainable Population Australia for sponsoring this session. My name is Paul Beckwith. I'm a climate system scientist. I teach at the University of Ottawa and at Carleton University, but mostly I teach online, having 1,000 plus YouTube videos. So I've got two guest panelists here. There's one remote, and that is Sir David King. Sir David King is the founder and chair of the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, as well as the Center for Climate Repair at Cambridge University. Before that, he held the position of Permanent Special Representative for Climate Change from September 2013 until March 2017. He was Government Chief Scientific Advisor for the UK government between 2000 and 2007, raising awareness on climate change. And over on my right, I have Dr. Fatima Denton. She's the director of the United Nations University Institute for Natural Resources in Africa. And before that, she worked with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and the African Climate Policy Center. So she's all about adaptation and focusing on climate resilience of systems. And on my left here, I have Mark Maslin. He's a professor of Earth System Science at UCL. He's the leading scientist with expertise in understanding the Anthropocene and how it relates to the major challenges facing humanity in the 21st centuries. He's also the director of Resitech and the author of Human Planet, Cradle of Humanity, and How to Save Our Planet. What we do is we call for COP27 to address and compensate for loss and damage without delay and the infinite loss from climate impact. We want that to be at the forefront of negotiations. And this is mostly using a 3R strategy: reduce, remove, repair, to frame a just transition and provide the only way forward for a manageable future for humanity. So first I'm going to bring up Sir David King.
What I want to talk to you about is the Climate Crisis Advisory Group's report on the path beyond fossil fuels. The subheading is Seeking a Just and Orderly Transition. What I think is critically important to understand, this report sets out the costs of a global energy transition. We point out that the costs are significant, but very modest in comparison to the profits currently being generated by the oil sector. They've been making an estimated $3 billion a day for some 50 years. So we just need to bear in mind the context of the overall cost of energy and how the transition is going to involve a switch away from all fossil fuel-based energies. Now, what is important to understand is the state of the world today. We know that with the rise in temperatures occurring so rapidly, particularly in the Arctic Circle region, the whole planet is now under threat. And if we're going to create a manageable future for humanity, we will have to have a deep and rapid emissions reduction process for all countries in the world. So we need this in the shortest possible time. Yes, we're aiming for net zero by 2050, but quite frankly, any time shorter than that will be a considerable help to everybody in the world. So we need to understand the absolute urgency of the task in hand and the need to start from where we are. Instead, each country must currently take full responsibility for its own pathway. It is crucial that the wealthiest nations, which have done the most to put high levels of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, carry the greatest financial responsibility going forward. And that financial responsibility means they need to be defossilizing their economies faster than the rest of the world. We must get there well before 2050 with the developed world, and at the same time, do their best to help developing countries make this transition. So let's look at the key transition parameters. The CCAG is calling for a whole series of processes to be put in place. Carbon pricing, regulation, assistance to developing countries must all be part of this solution, led by this group of willing nations to carry out the specific annual emissions reduction targets, with reductions starting immediately. There is, I'm afraid, already a loss of trust between the developing and the developed world. And this loss of trust became very apparent at COP26. The continued absence of promised climate funding to support poorer countries' management of climate change impacts has had a well-reported corrosive impact on trust. Regaining trust will be critical if countries are to work together effectively. 2010 was the date when the developed world promised $100 billion a year to assist the developing world to make this transition and to deal with the impacts of climate change. That fund has never reached anything like that sum. It was intended to be public money. It was intended to be funneled through the Green Climate Fund, and the Green Climate Fund has been consistently underfunded. The alternatives to fossil fuel require governments to pull all available levers, and different countries doing this at different times to achieve this. Government action has been very successful in developing cheaper alternative energy sources, where governments have introduced, for example, feed-in tariffs. It is government actions and regulations that drives us forward. Now, the energy transition demands that we look at different platforms. There are multiple dimensions: labor, finance, research and development, governance, decommissioning of fossil fuel systems, and so on. Now, some of these areas already have platforms capable of delivering, and finance, in fact, has many of these, trading and regulatory norms and so on. But we need all of these brought into action much more quickly. We need to also really look at the energy transition benefits. There's so many win-wins in achieving the energy transition. Energy bills are lower, while absolute energy needs reduced due to new efficiencies produced in the transition process. Air quality improves. Mobility in cities is safer, quicker, more dignified and inclusive. Active lives are more easily led, and health outcomes improve. We see all of these advantages. Nations experience economic growth and job creation when they build reliance on local energy supplies from solar, wind, and hydropower. Economic growth can also go hand in hand with reforestation and regenerative farming. Now, if we just look at the tipping points and infinite loss question, we know that if the West African or Indian monsoons were to fail, and this is a possibility, there's no monetary compensation that could possibly make up for the loss. Equally, if there was heat stress in a given part of the world, it is quite feasible that countries where air conditioning is not feasible for most people, that we could see upwards of 1 million people dying of heat stress in one of these heat-related events that are now happening around the world. Extreme heat is extremely difficult to deal with in terms of human ability to survive. So we know that all of these severe tipping points that we talk about can lead to massive transitions. So what we see is the possibility of infinite loss appearing, and infinite loss actually, of course, is the big challenge. And what this means is speeding up that transition to the alternative energy sources, to fossil fuel sources, not creating more availability of fossil fuels. So I believe this report is dealing with the crucial transition that is required and what is needed to achieve it. We really have to focus on all aspects of this. And in that sentence, who do I mean by we? All of us. And therefore, we must see that the United Nations finds a way to see that we can create a more orderly transition, a more just transition to the fossil fuel-free future that we need. Thank you.
Okay, so that was Sir David King discussing the report from the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, CCAG, in the UK. And now I'd like to pass the floor over to Dr. Fatima Denton.
Thank you. Let me start off by saying that at the heart of the climate crisis is a food system crisis. The food system is an important part of our collective humanity. We have millions of smallholder farmers that very much rely on the food system and very much rely on rain-fed agriculture and are witnessing quite a series of disruptions. Many of these disruptions are a result of climate change, but there are other disruptions as well that have been there for a long time that are part of structural difficulties that have now been superimposed on climate-related impacts. So our ability to get to a just and equitable transition depends very much on what we do in the food systems and what we do also to support agricultural practices and smallholder farmers. I think it's important to say that smallholder farmers do come under a lot of difficulties because of their farming practices. And also just to emphasize the fact that the food systems are going to make up to about 70% of our emissions between now and 2050, which is significantly more. We've always had a tendency of looking at our energy systems as the main culprits and not much at the food systems. And I think if we really want to get to an equitable and just transition, we also have to see how we could couple food, energy, and even water systems. But also to mention that the reason why we're all talking about just transition in the way we have been doing is because this is not about just getting to some sort of destination point. This is not about arriving at some sort of point in the discussion where we say we've arrived at a just transition. This is about the equity aspect of a just transition. It's at the very heart of the transformation that we're looking for, mainly because of the fact that the scale of the transition matters, The speed of the transition matters, but the quality of the transition also matters. So we really need to make sure that we are taking people along with us. Many of the smallholder farmers, for instance, in Africa, do not have the relevant safety nets that they need. Many of them are already on the margins of development and have been on the margins of development for a long time. They do not have the necessary inputs, fertilizers, they don't have the necessary credits, infrastructure is often in deficit. So they have been in the front line for a long time. With the current crisis that we are seeing in Ukraine, for instance, and also with COVID, I think this has actually decimated economies across the world, but mainly because smallholder farmers, because of their heavy reliance on rain-fed agriculture, have suffered even more. So a just transition is also one that we have to be mindful of the orientation of the transition. Smallholder farmers do not have the luxury of making decisions on how they want the transition to be. And I think it's very important that this decision, this COP27, that parties to the convention do not spend too much time hedging their bets, because we're not at that sort of luxury point where we can hedge our bets. We're actually at an inflection point, and there are lots of things that are already happening. So we need to really be mindful of how we bring people along with us, how we take care of issues around value chains, because most value chains are broken, and how we ensure that we have a functional food system that can actually feed people, but also sustain lives as well. So these are some of the big issues we're dealing with, and some of the big issues that have just transition implications, because the people that matter are not very often in rooms like this to really decide on what they want out of the transition. And so we have to be really careful about how we design, how we orient, and how we support the transition, so that those that are at the front, in the front line, do not end up losing doubly. So that's what I would say regarding the food system. And hand over to you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Fatima. And now I'd like to pass the floor over to Mark Maslin.
Thank you very much. We have to remember that 7 million children die needlessly every year of preventable diseases and starvation. 825 million people go to bed feeling hungry every night, in a world where we produce enough food for 10 billion people, when we only have 8 billion on the planet. We also have to remember that 1 billion people still do not have safe access to fresh water. This is the state of the planet now, and we have to transition in a fair and just way to lift billions of people out of extreme poverty. One of the key things is, of course, energy poverty. At the moment, 80% of the world's energy is produced by fossil fuels. The estimates by many learned institutions is that we'll have to double the amount of energy we produce in the world by 2050, which will allow all of those people access for the energy they required for a safe, healthy life. Therefore, we have to generate 180% of the world's energy in clean, renewable, if we're going to do this transition properly. As Sir David said, key things are we need an agreement on loss and damage, because there is a historic legacy whereby we need to actually compensate the least developed countries for the damage they're already having. We need to fund adaptation, because farmers of the world, as Fatima has said, need our support to continue growing the food that is essential for the growing population. Another 2 billion people will be on the planet by 2050. And that 100 billion that we've promised since 2009, ratified in 2010, that we still in the Western world have not produced, is chicken feed. It is small change, but it's basically making us look like untrustworthy world partners. And the last thing I would like to pick up on in the report is the idea of infinite loss. Our economic system cannot calculate the cost of replacing the whole of the great barrier reef. It cannot actually cost in the loss of the Asiatic cheetah, of which there are only 13 left in the world. It cannot do that. Our economics is broken, and we need to deal with the idea of not just loss, but infinite loss on this planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So just to add a few things, humans tend to think in a linear fashion, right? We kind of look for trends and we assume they're happening sort of slowly, but we're not able to get our minds around the idea of exponential growth that well at all. We're not able to figure out, what nonlinear abruptness in a system means. And this is what we're experiencing in the climate system. It's a highly nonlinear system. We could very, very quickly, for example, lose the Arctic sea ice one summer, and Arctic temperatures will skyrocket, so the Arctic will become much, much warmer. The ice will take longer to form in the fall, winter. It will go much quicker in the spring. And so the Arctic being a much, much warmer place means that the jet streams will be much more disrupted, and therefore extreme weather events around the planet will greatly accelerate in intensity, duration, and frequency above and beyond what we have now. In fact, in 5 or 10 years, we may look back at today's climate system and think of it as being a relatively stable system, because what we can have in 5, 10 years is basically unrecognizable, and we'll have to learn how to grow enough food to feed the ever rising human population, and it's really a struggle for survival of humanity on this planet, but not just for humanity, but also for all the plants and animals, and everything we think of as a civilized society will be under threat. So, Fatima, would you like to add anything further?
No, perhaps what I wanted to say is, I think Sir David talked about the whole aspect related to energy, and as I said before, this is an important sector where we can do quite a lot of ambitious reduction. But I also think that we can't go towards a just transition without taking into account the whole aspect of climate finance. The transition would not finance itself. There are big major investment that has to be made. I'm coming from an organization that works very much with countries in Africa, and many of these countries are very resource rich, and most of the resources are resources in energy, and I would say hydrocarbon resources, oil and gas. These resources are going to become stranded, and when they become stranded, they would need to have some sort of alternative source of revenue. And those alternative sources of revenue will be important for the strategic development, not least the SDGs. So I think we need to really think about how we can ramp up support, especially support in terms of renewable. Renewables have a lot of benefits, but there are also problems in terms of storage and in terms of how we have a higher penetration of renewables in many of these countries, and we're not there yet. So I don't think we should be complacent and say we have got all the renewables we need and we can just sort of go on this pathway, because there are issues around renewables, and we should look at how we could support countries to ramp up their investments so that renewables become a lot easier than what they are now.
Yes, thank you very much for that. And I often say, we're all familiar with tipping points now, and most of them are negative, but we need to actually have tipping points in human understanding on how serious the climate crisis is, as well as tipping points in our action to adapt and mitigate and reduce the problem. So Mark, any final statements?
Certainly, and I hate to end one of these wonderful events actually quoting Tom Cruise, but actually I think the message for this COP is show me the money. Because again, as Fatima says, it's about climate finance. It is about the money in the world. We generate $88 trillion in the world every single year. It goes to a very small number of people. If you fairly shared that out and you had a just transition, suddenly you would have 10 billion people living a safe and probably much happier life in the future by 2050.
Thank you, Mark. And I, Paul Beckwith, on behalf of the Climate Emergency Forum, I wish to thank David and Fatima and Mark for very interesting discussions, and also the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, as well as Sustainable Population Australia, for allowing us this session. So thank you for attending. Enjoy the rest of the COP.